So in 2004, Ken Jennings stunned North American TV audiences when he won a record 74 consecutive games of the popular game show Jeopardy, winning more than $2,520,700 in the process. Mr. Jennings answered questions about literature, geography, sports, science, politics, and popular culture, consistently outperforming his co-contestants for more than a year. During the last weeks of Jennings' amazing streak, Jeopardy's ratings skyrocketed by 22%. Each day, millions of viewers tuned in to watch Jennings perform. The popularity of Ken's success speaks to people's obsession with maximizing memory, perhaps driven by the same urge that has led humans to develop written language, the printing press, photography, and computers, all human interventions that aid with memory. The popularity of shows like Jeopardy and the proliferation of memory aids indicate that people value memory and constantly seek ways to improve it. So in this lecture, we'll talk about semantic memory, and we'll see that everyday processes that people like Ken Jennings used when he conquered Jeopardy rather, we can utilize the same everyday processes to expand our own semantic memory. Our memory for knowledge of the world, from literature to knitting to politics to gossip, is called semantic memory. Semantic memory is broadly defined as general knowledge about the world and includes topics as diverse as history, sports, geography, pop culture, and music. It covers a broad range of topics, but what unites these topics is that the memory involved in storage of general knowledge has a common representational system. So semantic memory is thought of as being supported by a separate neurocognitive system than episodic memory. So episodic memory has a temporal dynamic in that we attribute retrieval from episodic memory to either the past or the future. In contrast, semantic memory, we attribute information as being a general truth about the world, kind of irrespective of time. So we'll talk about how people represent information in semantic memory, as well as information about encoding and retrieval of semantic memories. So in summary, semantic memory is the neurocognitive system that is distinct from episodic memory and encodes, stores, and retrieves information concerning knowledge about the world. So again, just to compare semantic and episodic memory really quick. Episodic memory is memory for specific events in a particular context that includes conscious recollection or mental time travel, as opposed to semantic memory, which is an explicit memory system for general knowledge and facts, which lacks reference to a particular episode or event that was learned. So this could include everything from world knowledge to vocabulary to rules and formulas and algorithms, um, whereas episodic memory includes specific episodes or events throughout one's personal life. So now let's talk about some of the scientific evidence that supports the discrimination between semantic and episodic memory. So patients with anterograde amnesia, such as HM, for example, have profound deficits in episodic memory, but usually have only minor deficits in semantic memories. So we talked about the Varga and Kadim 1997 study with patients that were afflicted with a developmental or congenital form of amnesia as children. So they were unable to remember events and episodes in their life, but they had a relatively normal semantic memory. In contrast, participants or patients with retrograde amnesia often have a selective deficit in either episodic or semantic memory. So they often have episodic impairment with spared semantic memory, um, as such as Tolving's patient KC, who had an intact pre-trauma semantic memory, but a severely impaired episodic memory. And there have been a few isolated instances of semantic memory impairment with spared pre-trauma episodic memory. Right? So once again, we have ample evidence from neuropsychological studies that episodic and semantic memory are different neurocognitive systems. We also see this with different neuroimaging studies that utilize fMRI and PET scanners, for example. So Wheeler and colleagues found that different brain regions were activated for semantic and episodic memory tasks. So during encoding of semantic information, um, there was more activity in the left prefrontal cortex for episodic tasks relative to semantic ones. And during memory retrieval, there was more right prefrontal cortical activity during episodic memory retrieval than semantic memory retrieval. So one of the things that we discussed in my last video on episodic memory was how semantic memories are created from repeated episodic memories over time, right? So I gave the example of learning your state capitals at 7 years old, right? So if I were to probe your memory for state capitals when you were 7.5 years old or 8 years old, you would not only have the facts, right? So you would know, for example, that Atlanta is the capital of Georgia and Richmond is the capital of Virginia, but you would also remember the particular day at school in which you learned that information. So you would remember your teacher's name, maybe the dress that she was wearing. You would remember the words to the song that you learned for the state capitals. You would remember the worksheet that you completed and maybe an activity that you did with drawing maps with sidewalk chalk, right? So that would be a very richly detailed episodic memory. But if I were to wait 10 years and again probe your memory for state capitals, it's likely that you would just kind of recite that, recite them off without actually thinking about the particular episode in which you learned that information, right? So over time, semantic memories are created when specific learning episodes become stripped of their contextual details, such as time, location, things like that, right? So, one of the interesting experiments that investigated this was a study where they took individuals who were so they looked at older adults' memories for various events over a 50-year period. And basically, they utilized the Remember No procedure that we talked about in my last video. So they were presented with a keyword to activate memory for an event, and they had to indicate whether they remember contextual details about the event. So in that case, they would give a remember judgment, or whether they were familiar with the event but couldn't actually access the particular contextual details in which the event occurred, right? So if they gave a remember judgment, that would indicate an episodic memory, Whereas if they gave a no judgment, that would indicate semantic memory. And so what we see is that over time, people gave more "I don't know" responses, which indicates that obviously over time, information becomes less available and is forgotten, right? So that's one effect. But a more interesting effect is that when these older adults were, their memories were probed, 10 years after the event, they gave about 40% of their recollections were remember recollections. So they were still able to recall a lot of the contextual details for the specific events themselves, right? So, for example, if we're talking about a wedding, right? So if I prompted you to think about your wedding anniversary, right? An episodic memory would include what you ate for breakfast that day, the family members that were visiting for your wedding, maybe the fact that your wedding dress tore the first time you tried it on, or something like that. Whereas a semantic memory or a no recollection would be, yes, I got married on February 21st, 1983, but not being able to remember the actual wedding, right? So what they found is that 10 years after the events occurred, there were a lot more remember judgments, which indicates intact episodic memory. So we see that in the green bar. But after a 40-year retention interval, a lot of those remember judgments became no judgments. So basically, there's a loss of episodic details for long ago events that occurred, 40 to 50 years prior, as opposed to more recently occurring events that occurred within 5 or 10 years. So over time, a lot of our episodic memories become converted to semantic memories. So, generally speaking, each of us knows countless facts about the world. So, one goal of memory researchers is to try to model how all of this information is represented in one's neurocognitive system, not to mention how it's physically stored in the brain. So, in order to achieve this goal, a lot of memory theorists have focused on associative models of semantic memory. So an associative model means that we represent information in semantic memory in terms of connections among units of information. So a node is the unit of memory which is then connected to other nodes. So, for example, you might have a node for the 18th century British philosopher George Berkeley, who championed the ideas of associationism. The node for the memory of this philosopher might be linked to the node for John Locke, who was another very prominent associationist philosopher. And that might be connected to the node for the University of California at Berkeley and to the node for Charles Barkley, the star basketball player for the Philadelphia 76ers in the 1980s and 90s. So nodes may be strongly connected, as in the Berkeley-Locke association, or less strongly connected, as in the Berkeley-UC Berkeley connection and the Berkeley-Barkley connection. Eventually, as the activation spreads to multiple nodes, it fades and we can no longer see this trail of activation. Thus, in association models of semantic memory, our memory is kind of like a web of interconnected ideas and facts. Okay, so a lot of the models of semantic memory that we're going to talk about are based on this associative model idea, which essentially says that we represent information in semantic memory in terms of connections among units of information. So a unit of information in semantic memory is referred to as a node, which is connected to other units of information or nodes. And some of those connections are going to be relatively strong and straightforward, whereas other connections might be weaker. But as we continue to have experiences, those nodes will either be made stronger or made weaker. And one thing to keep in mind is that these associative models are cognitive or mentalistic models. So we're not actually like linking a particular idea to a neuron in the brain or anything like that. We're just trying to model sort of the cognitive processes associated with memories in semantic memory. So in the late 1960s, Ross Killian was developing a computer program to read text and needed the program to know facts in order to understand text. So Killian needed to conserve space on the hard drive, so he wrote a program that arranged concepts efficiently in a hierarchy. So once he had written the program, Killian speculated that the human brain likely represented material in a similarly efficient way, and thus, with the help of Alan Collins, conceived of the hierarchical network model of semantic memory. So this was pretty much in the heyday of the information processing approach, right? So Collins and Killian were attempting to use computer programs to kind of hypothesize how the mind works, right? So in this model, concepts are arranged from the most general at the top to the most specific at the bottom, and facts related to concepts are stored at the highest level to which they apply. So this structure minimizes redundancy of information, and the hierarchical model makes clear predictions about how long it will take for a person to verify different types of sentences using a sentence verification task. So the hierarchical model stipulates that traveling through the hierarchy takes time, and that the more traveling through more levels takes more time, and that it will take about the same amount of time to move around the network no matter what level you start at, right? So let me give you a more concrete example. So if you have to travel through three concepts to get from goldfish to has gills, right? So goldfish, fish, gills, it will take the same amount of time as traveling through three concepts to get from minivan to powered by gasoline to or minivan to powered by gasoline. So, for example, you'll go from minivan to motor vehicle to powered by gasoline, right? So, taken together, the model predicts that participants would verify the sentence, a salmon eats more slowly than a salmon is pink, because they would need to travel up the hierarchy to the animal node to verify that the salmon eats, whereas they would not need to travel at all to verify that a salmon is pink, right? So Collins and Killian presented participants with true and false statements about topics including games, animals, beverages, and trees. And they found that when the participants had to traverse more levels in the hierarchy, they were slower to verify that a sentence was true. Although Collins and Killian created a model that withstood a basic prediction that some sentences will be recognized more quickly than others, the model is problematic for several reasons. First, the hierarchical model doesn't really explain how participants are able to respond to a sentence as false. So, for example, consider the sentence, salmon has fur, right? Participants quickly respond that this sentence is false. However, the model seems to predict that participants would need to consult the entire hierarchy before establishing that that property of having fur was absent. So, again, just to reiterate some of the evidence that seems to support the hierarchical network model, is that reaction time to answer those true false questions is directly related to the number of levels that have to be traversed in the hierarchy, right? So if I were to ask you, for example, a canary is a canary, right? You would immediately say yes because you don't have to traverse any nodes, right? You would just look at the canary node and agree that a canary is a canary. What if I were to ask you, is a canary a bird? Right? So in that case, you would only have to travel from the canary node to the bird node. So it's going to take you a little bit longer than if I were to ask you if a canary is a canary, but not much. And then if I were to ask you, is a canary an animal, right? You would have to start at the canary node, travel up to the bird node, and then travel up from the bird node to the animal node, right? So that would take that would require you to traverse two levels. So if we look at reaction time on the y-axis, we see that reaction time is directly linearly related to the number of levels you have to travel. And similarly, we can also see that with properties, right? So if I were to ask you if a canary can sing, right? So you can't actually see that in this picture, but next to the canary node are the properties is yellow and can sing, right? So you don't actually have to travel to a different node to answer that as being true. But for the canary, a canary can fly statement, you would have to travel to the bird node, which also has the properties, has wings, and can fly. So that would be traveling up one level. And then lastly, a canary has skin. It's kind of a weird, creepy question, but basically you would have to travel from the canary node to the bird node, and then from the bird node to the animal node. And one of the properties of animals in the original model is that it has skin. Okay, so that's some of the supporting evidence in favor of the Collins and Killian hierarchical network model. So, despite the fact that the hierarchical model predicts the different examples I just showed you on the previous slide, there are several limitations with this theory. So, first, in 1972, a researcher by the name of Conrad discovered that people are slow to verify strange sentences, such as a canary has skin, because it's very unfamiliar. It's a strange question, rather than because of the large hierarchical distance between the concept and its property. So thus, key findings do not actually provide much support for the model. Second, if we consider statements such as a canary is a bird and a penguin is a bird, according to the theory, both statements should take the same length of time to verify because they both involve moving one level up in the hierarchy. In fact, the latter statement, that a penguin is a bird, takes longer because canaries are much more typical representatives of the bird category than penguins. So, for example, Rips and colleagues 1973 found that verification or reaction times were faster for more typical or representative category members than atypical ones. So it took people longer to say that an ostrich is a bird than a canary is a bird. So this is referred to as the typicality effect. Third, Collins and Killian mistakenly assumed that the concepts we use belong to rigidly defined categories. But McCloskey and colleagues in 1978 gave 30 people tricky questions, such as, is a stroke a disease? And is a pumpkin a fruit? And they found that 16 said that a stroke is a disease, but 14 said that it was not. And a pumpkin was regarded as a fruit by 16 participants, but not as a fruit by the remainder. So when McCloskey and colleagues tested the same participants a month later, 11 of them had changed their minds about a stroke being a disease, and 8 had decided that pumpkin was a fruit. Right? So what that suggests is that categories aren't always fixed, right? Sometimes we change our minds about whether a particular exemplar belongs to one category or another. So they're much more flexible or variable than we think. And in another paper, Verhin and Storms, 2013, identified 2 reasons for individual differences in deciding which items belong to a given category. First, there is ambiguity. Individuals may use different criteria for categorization, such as is a strenuous activity a necessary criterion for something to be regarded as a sport? And second, there's a degree of vagueness, right? So individuals may use different cutoffs to separate members of a category from non-members. So for example, 2 individuals may agree that being strenuous is a criterion for an activity being considered a sport, but they may disagree about how strenuous it must be, right? So finally, um, a related paper found that older people were more likely to assign an object to a category if it were made of traditional materials, such as a box being made of cardboard, whereas younger ones were more influenced by the use of newer materials, so a box made of plastic. Right? So all of this basically illustrates one limitation of the hierarchical model, and that is that concepts and categories are much more fluid and difficult to reliably predict compared to other things, right? Um, and because of that inherent flexibility in whether a particular node belongs to a category or not, we can observe many different effects, basically. So one last criticism of the hierarchical model that I've already mentioned um, is that the hierarchical model predicts that the further a person has to move throughout the hierarchy, the slower they'll be at making a particular judgment. But Lance and colleagues demonstrated that participants are faster to verify that a pig is an animal than a pig is a mammal, even though a strictly hierarchical model would predict the opposite, right? So a mammal is a subset of animal, right? So, um, for example, even though answering the question a pig is a mammal is only one step from the pig node to the mammal node, it actually takes people longer to say that a pig is um, a mammal than a pig is an animal, which would represent moving from not only one node, but 2 nodes. So sometimes what appears to be the case is not the number of nodes you have to traverse to answer a question, but how common or frequent the category labels are. Right? So we hear the word animal much more frequently than we hear the word mammal. And so because participants are more familiar with the word animal, it's easier for them to make that judgment, if that makes sense. So continuing with our discussion of semantic memory, now we're going to talk about concepts and categories. So a concept is a mental representation used for a variety of cognitive functions, including memory, reasoning, and using and understanding language, whereas categorization is a process of placing concepts into groups, right? So imagine um, that you are in an unfamiliar town. So imagine that you find yourself in an unfamiliar town where you have never been before. As you walk down the street, you notice that many things are not exactly the same as what you would encounter if you were in your own town. On the other hand, there are lots of things that seem familiar. Cars pass by, there are buildings on either side of the street, and a gas station on the corner, and maybe a cat dashes across the street and makes it safely to the other side. Luckily, you know a lot about cars, about buildings, about gas stations, and cats, so you have no trouble understanding what's going on. You know about the various components of this street scene because your mind is full of concepts. A concept is a mental representation that is used for a variety of cognitive functions, including memory, reasoning, and understanding language. Thus, when you think about cats, you are drawing on a concept or mental representation, which includes information about what cats are, what they usually look like, how they behave, and so on. By far the most commonly studied function of concepts is categorization, which is the process by which concepts are placed into groups called categories. So, for example, when you see vehicles in the street, you can place them into categories such as cars, SUVs, different brands, so Chevrolets versus Fords versus American and foreign cars. So, categories are not simply convenient ways of sorting objects, they are also tools that are essential for our understanding of the world. So here are some examples of common categorizations. So for example, you can categorize objects that you encounter in the physical world. So you can look at tables versus chairs, cars versus dogs and cats versus trees, bodies of water, etc. You can also categorize types of people by such thing as occupation. So, for example, police, men and women, teachers, students, politicians, etc. You can also categorize people based on relationships that you have or adjectives that you know that describe them. So, a friend versus an enemy, someone who is helpful and smart or inconsiderate or rude, for example. You can categorize based on race and ethnicity and religious identification. And you can also make more abstract categorizations, right? So, for example, you can categorize a crime um, as as being theft, for example, or something more abstract like I don't know, letting someone waste their own potential is a crime. Um, you can categorize someone as being a relative of yours. You can categorize, and you can categorize someone as being a relative of yours either based on blood relation or maybe based upon the importance of that person to you. So you can say that that person is your brother or sister, not by blood relation, but just based on the strength of your bond with them. Um, and you can categorize things like credit in a financial sense, or maybe as social or reputational credit. And one of the most important purposes of categories is that they allow us to make different inferences. So, for example, um, if you see a dog and say that is either a dog or a mammal or a specific breed of dog, such as a collie or a rat terrier, right? The type of inference you're making is to categorize an object or put it into a category. But you can also do other things, right? So if a friend tells me I have a collie, and I think to myself, I hope she doesn't mind dog hair on all of her clothes, right? You're making an inference based on the dog's membership to the category collie that she's going to have specific properties, such as shedding a lot of hair, right? And similarly, if a friend tells me that fluorescent light can wreck a compact disc, and such that it no longer holds any data on it, I might wonder to myself, does the same thing happen to DVDs, right? So in this case, we're drawing an inference from a property of one category and trying to infer a possible property of another related category. But one of the most important functions of a category is to help us understand individual cases we may never have seen before. So, for example, being able to say that a furry animal across the street is a cat provides a great deal of information about it, such as likes milk, likes fish, catches mice, difficult to train, has whiskers, sleeps a lot, but is more active at night, meows and purrs, etc. Right? So, membership of a novel object to a category provides us with a lot of information, right? So categories have therefore been called pointers of knowledge. So once you know that something is in a category, whether it's cat, gas station, impressionist painting, or any number of things, you know a lot of general things about it and can focus your energy on specifying what's special about this particular object. So being able to place things in categories can also help us understand behaviors that we might otherwise find baffling. So for example, if we see a man with the left side of his face painted black and the right side painted gold, we might wonder what's going on. However, once we note that that person is heading toward a football stadium and it's Sunday afternoon, we can characterize that person as a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, right? So placing him in that category explains his painted face and maybe some of the other behaviors going on that particular day. According to the definitional approach to categorization, we can decide whether something is a member of a category by determining whether a particular object meets the definition of the category. So definitions work really well for some things, such as geometric objects, right? So thus defining a square is as simple as a plane figure having four equal sides. However, for most natural objects, such as birds, trees, and plants, and many human-made objects like chairs, definitions don't work well at all. Right? So the problem with the definitional approach is that not all members of everyday categories have the same features. So although the dictionary definition of a chair is a piece of furniture consisting of a seat, legs, back, and often arms designed to accommodate one person, um, there are objects that we call chairs that don't meet that definition. So, for example, if we look at the figure, even though the chairs in A and B, uh, in the panels A and B, would be classified by this definition, the ones in panels C and D would not, right? Most chairs have legs and a back, as specified in the definition, but most people would call the disc-shaped chair or the disc-shaped object um, and even a rock formation would qualify as a chair as long as it's being used for the purpose of sitting, essentially. So, again, according to the definitional approach of categorization, category membership can be determined by checking off a list of necessary and sufficient features, right? So, for example, if we were to define a teacup, a list of necessary and sufficient features might be that it's a concrete object, that's concave or empty in the center, that it holds liquids, and has a handle, right? But very quickly we realize that there are objects classified as teacups that would not include all of these features. So, for example, there are some Chinese teacups, many in fact, that don't have a handle. There are also teacups made of lacquer for decoration purposes, right? So even though these objects would be classified as teacups, they don't have one or more of those sort of qualifying features. So eventually, psychologists realized that the definitional approach was not sufficient to explain categorization. And in a very famous paper, Ludwig Wittgenstein was quoted as saying this about games. So consider, for example, the proceedings we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. For if you look at them, you will not see something common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. So Wittgenstein is credited with creating the family resemblance approach to categorization. And so under this approach, unlike with the definitional approach, right, what Wittgenstein proposed with his idea of family resemblance was to deal with the problem of the definitional approach. Family resemblance refers to the idea that things in a particular category resemble one another in a number of ways. Thus, instead of setting definitive criteria that every member of a category must meet, the family resemblance approach allows for some variation within a category. Chairs may come in many different sizes and shapes and configurations and be made of many different materials, but every chair does resemble other chairs in some way. So looking at category membership in this way, we can see that the chair in the figure I just showed you and the beanbag chair do have in common that they offer a place to sit, a way to support one's back, and perhaps a place to rest the arms while sitting. So the idea of family resemblance has led psychologists to propose that categorization is based on determining how similar an object is to some standard representation of a category. So here's an example to explain Wittgenstein's family resemblance approach. So basically, he proposed that members of a category have a family resemblance to each other. And so basically, members of a category have many similarities with one another without having a single definitive feature in common. So in this particular example, many of the people in this family have dark hair, they have glasses, they have a mustache and a big nose, for example. So those are features that are typical for members of this category, but they don't define the family, right? So each of these individual members may have some of the characteristic features, but not all of them. Okay, so we talked about the definitional approach and the family resemblance approach. So now we'll talk about the prototype approach to categorization. And so basically, according to the prototype theory of categorization, membership in a category is determined by comparing the object to a prototype that represents the category. So a prototype is a typical member of that category. So what is a typical member of a particular category? Eleanor Roche in 1973 proposed that the typical prototype is based on a statistical average of all of the members of that category that are commonly experienced. So, for example, the prototype for the category birds might be based on some of the birds you usually see, such as sparrows, robins, and blue jays, but doesn't necessarily look exactly like a particular type of bird. Thus, the prototype is not an actual member of the category, but is instead an average representation of the category. Right? So, as you can see, if your typical exemplars of the bird category are sparrows, robins, and blue jays, shown in the first three images of that diagram, then your prototype is sort of a summation or average of all of those features. So your prototype in this case isn't an actual bird, but rather a conglomeration of some components of blue jays, robins, and sparrows, right? So membership in a category is determined by comparing the novel object to a prototype or average of all of the members of a category based on prior experience. Of course, not all birds are like robins, blue jays, or sparrows. Owls, penguins, and buzzards are also birds. So Eleanor Roche describes these variations within categories as representing differences in prototypicality. High prototypicality means that a category member closely resembles the category prototype, whereas low prototypicality means that a category member does not closely resemble a typical member of that category. So to further quantify this, Roche presented participants with a category title, such as bird or furniture, and a list of about 50 members of the category. The participants' task was to rate the extent to which each member of the category represented the category within a 7-point scale. So a rating of 1 would mean that that member is a very good example of the category. So for example, a bird like a sparrow would get a rating of 1, whereas a bird like an ostrich or a buzzard would probably get a rating closer to 7, meaning that it's a poor example of that category. The results were that for some of the objects in the two different categories shown, the 1.18 rating for sparrow reflects the fact that most people would agree that a sparrow is a good example of a bird, and the 4.53 rating for penguin and 6.5 rating for bat reflects the fact that penguins and bats are not considered good examples of birds. Similarly, chair and sofa are considered very good examples of the category furniture, but mirror and telephone are considered poor examples. So the idea that sparrows are a better example of bird than penguins or bats is not very surprising. But Roche went beyond this obvious result by doing a series of experiments that demonstrated differences between good and bad examples of a category. So one of Eleanor Roche's most famous experiments she conducted with Mervis in 1975. And basically what they did is they gave people objects that were typical members of a category. So for example, a chair and a sofa, and they asked them to come up with things that those two objects have in common. And so when the objects were prototypical members of the category furniture, people could come up with a lot of similarities. Whereas when they were given the task of finding similarities between, for example, a mirror and a telephone, they didn't find a lot of similarities. So basically, in this experiment, they demonstrated there's a strong positive relationship between prototypicality, or how typical an object is to other members of a category, and family resemblance, right? So when items have a large amount of overlap with characteristics of other items in the category, the family resemblance of these items is high, whereas when there's a low amount of overlap, the family resemblance is low. So prototypical objects such as chair and couch, for example, or chair and sofa, have high family resemblance or similar features, whereas less prototypical objects of the category furniture, like phone and mirror, have less family resemblance. So Edward Smith and co-workers in 1974 used the same sentence verification technique that we talked about earlier to determine how rapidly people could answer questions about an object's category. When Smith and co-workers used this technique, they found that participants responded faster for objects that are high in prototypicality, such as the question, is an apple a fruit, than they did for objects that are low in prototypicality, such as, is a pomegranate a fruit? So the ability to judge highly prototypical objects more rapidly is again called the typicality effect. So the more typical an exemplar is to a given category, the faster you're going to be able to do a sentence verification task where you identify that exemplar as a member of the category. Another interesting finding is that prototypical objects, such as sofa and chair for the category furniture, or apple and orange for the category fruit, um, when participants are asked to list as many exemplars of a category as possible, they tend to list the most prototypical items first. So, for example, for the category birds, people would list sparrows, blue jays, and robins, and canaries first, and then eventually get to ostriches, buzzards, and bats, which are less prototypical members of a category. So another interesting finding by Roche and colleagues in 1975 was that prototypical objects are more affected by priming. So priming occurs when presentation of a stimulus facilitates the response to another stimulus that usually follows closely in time. So for example, Roche 1975 demonstrated that prototypical members of a category are affected by a priming stimulus more than non-prototypical members. So the procedure for Roche's experiment is shown in the figure on the slide. And so basically, participants first heard the prime, which was the name of a color such as green. 2 seconds later, they saw a pair of colors side by side and indicated by pressing a key as quickly as possible whether the two colors were the same or different. The side by side colors were paired in three different ways. Colors were the same and were good examples of a category, such as primary reds, blues, and greens, or the colors were the same but were poor examples of a category. So, for example, less rich versions of colors, such as light blue or light green. And three, the colors were different with two colors coming from different categories, right? So, for example, pairing orange with blue. So the most important result occurred for the two same groups, because in this condition, priming resulted in faster same judgments for the prototypical colors condition than for the non-prototypical colors condition. So for example, when you saw the same color as good examples, it took people about 610 milliseconds to say yes, they're the same color, as opposed to when you saw two sort of light green, not prototypical examples of green, it took a longer period of time, so about 780 milliseconds, compared to when the colors are different, right? So having a prototypical member of the category green resulted in more of a priming benefit. And so essentially what Roche conjectured was happening in this experiment is the participant hears the word green and then conjures up the prototypical shade of green, right? So kind of the forest green color is conjured up in the mind, and then they compare that prototypical green to the match or to the presented colors, and when there's a good match or there's a high correspondence between the prototype and the object presented, it's faster, or it takes less time for people to respond, yes, that's green, than when there's a less prototypical shade of green being presented. Okay, so here we have a summary of all of the effects of prototypicality that seem to support the prototype theory of categorization. So, for example, we have family resemblance. So, things in a category resemble each other in a number of ways. So, there are higher ratings for high prototypicality items or prototypical items when people rate how good a member of a category is, right? So, there are higher prototypicality ratings for example, sparrow and blue jay than there are for bat and ostrich if your category is birds. We also see typicality effects. So people react rapidly to members of a category that are typical. So there's faster reaction time to statements like a sparrow is a bird than an ostrich is a bird. And an ostrich would be a less typical member of the category bird than a sparrow. We also see different naming effects. So people are more likely to list some of the objects than others when asked to name objects in a category. So highly prototypical items are named first when people list all of the members of a category. And finally, there are differential priming effects. So presentation of one stimulus affects responses to a stimulus that follows. So there are faster, same different color judgments for highly prototypical shades of green than less typical shades of green. The exemplar approach to categorization, like the prototype approach, involves determining whether an object is similar to a standard object, or whether a new object is similar to a standard object. However, Whereas the standard for the prototype approach is a single average member of a category, the standard for the exemplar approach involves many examples, each one called an exemplar. So exemplars, unlike prototypes, are actual members of the category that a person has encountered in the past. Thus, if a person has encountered sparrows, robins, and blue jays in the past, each of these would be an exemplar for the category birds. The exemplar approach can explain many of Eleanor Roche's results, which were used to support the prototype approach. So, for example, the exemplar approach explains the typicality effect, in which reaction times on sentence verification tasks are faster for better examples of a category than for poorer examples, by proposing that objects that are like more of the exemplars are classified faster. Thus, a sparrow is similar to many other exemplars, such as robins and blue jays, so it is classified faster than a penguin or a buzzard, which is similar to very few exemplars. This is basically the same idea as family resemblance described for prototypes, that states that better objects will have a higher family resemblance. So, which approach, prototypes or exemplars, provides a better description of how people use categories? Well, one advantage of the exemplar approach is that by using real world examples, it can more easily take into account atypical cases, such as birds that don't fly, right? So rather than comparing a penguin to an average prototype of a bird, we remember that there are some examples of birds that don't fly. So this ability to take into account individual cases means that the exemplar approach doesn't discard information that might be useful later. Thus, penguins, ostriches, and other birds that are not typical can be represented as individual exemplars rather than becoming lost in the overall average that goes into the prototype. The exemplar approach can also more easily deal with highly variable categories like games. And although it can be difficult to imagine the prototype, that a category that contains football, computer games, solitaire, marbles, and golf might be, the exemplar approach requires only that we remember some of these variable examples. So, based on the results of a number of research studies, some researchers have concluded that people may use both the prototype and the exemplar approach. It has been proposed that as we initially learn about a category, we may average exemplars into a prototype. Then later in learning, some of the exemplar information becomes stronger. Thus, early in learning, we would be poor at taking into account exceptions such as ostriches or penguins, but later exemplars for these cases would be added to the category. Other research indicates that the exemplar approach may work best for small categories, such as US presidents or mountains taller than 15,000 feet, and the prototype approach may work best for larger categories, such as birds or automobiles. So we can describe this blending of prototypes and exemplars in common sense terms with the following example. We know generally that cats are the prototype, but we know specifically our own cat the best, which would serve as an exemplar, right? So the best answer is that we utilize both of these approaches for different purposes. So the last concept that we are going to review in this lecture on semantic memory is schema or schemata and the influence of schemas on memory. So a schema or singular schemata It refers to knowledge that describes typical or frequent events in a particular situation. So a schema is helpful, um, for example, because your schema of a restaurant, for example, includes the script of events that typically occur. So, for example, you're given a menu, and then you're escorted by the hostess or host to your seat. First, you get your drink order, and then eventually your food comes, and then you eat it, and then you get a receipt and you tip 20%, and then you get up and leave, right? So schemas are helpful in the sense that they provide general knowledge that allows you to reconstruct events and also predict what might happen in the future, right? So it equips you to understand what will happen if you go to a restaurant in the future. But schemas can also be harmful in the sense that oftentimes our memories are regularized to conform with the expectations that are consistent with our schemas. So let's look at some examples. So, the researcher who is best known for his work studying the effects of schema on memory is Sir Frederick Bartlett, who was a British scientist. And so, basically, in his hallmark study, which took place in 1932, his participants included British school children, all of whom were boys, and they were basically asked to read this Native American folk tale and then recall the story over several instances across various retention intervals. So the story is as follows, and you can read along with me. So one night, two young men um, from Egulac went down to the river to hunt seals, and while they were there it became foggy and calm. Then they heard war cries, and they thought, maybe there is a war party. They escaped to the shore and hid behind a log. Now canoes came up, and they heard the noise of the paddles, and saw one canoe coming to them. There were 5 men in the canoe, and they said, "What do you think? We wish to take you along. We are going up the river to make war on the people." One of the young men said, "I have no arrows." "Arrows are in my canoe," they said. "I will um, I will not go along. I might be killed. My relatives do not know where I have gone. But you," he said, turning to the other, "may go with them." So one of the young men went, but the other one returned home. And the warriors went up the river to a town on the other side of Kalama. The people came down to the water, and they began to fight, and many were killed. But presently the young man heard one of the warriors say, "Quick, let us go home. The Indian has been hit." Now he thought, "Oh, they are ghosts." He did not feel sick, but they said he had been shot. So the canoes went back to Elgilac, and the young men went ashore to his house and made a fire. And he told everybody and said, "Behold, I accompanied the ghost, and I went to fight. Many of our fellows were killed, and many of those who attacked us were killed. They said I was hit, and I do not feel sick." He told it all, and then he became quiet. When the sun rose, he fell down. Something black came from his mouth. His face became contorted. The people jumped up and cried, "He was dead." Right? So right away we notice that this story is very difficult to understand, right? Um, and it's very difficult to sort of ascertain what the main plot of the story is. And so Bartlett noticed that right away when the young British schoolboys, were asked to retell the story, a lot of these details got distorted and omitted, and they particularly became omitted in accordance with the participants' individual cultural schemas. So, for example, when the participants retold the story, something black came from his mouth tended to become he frothed at the mouth, he vomited, or breath escaped from his mouth. Hunting seals became fishing, and canoes tended to become boats, whereas paddles became oars, right? Because these changes were an example of schemas or of the story becoming regularized to better fit the participants' schemas. And Bartlett also noticed that hard to interpret or difficult to understand items were completely omitted from the story, such as hiding behind the log or the connection between the injury and the termination of the battle. So Bartlett noticed that the participants reconstructed the story as they tried to remember it, which was a process that Bartlett identified as distortion. And there were three noticeable patterns of distortion. First, there was what Bartlett referred to as assimilation, where the story became more consistent with the participants' cultural expectations. So, changing canoe to boat and paddles to oars, for example. He also noticed a distortion that he referred to as leveling. So, leveling is when the story becomes shorter and more gist based as participants omit certain details, particularly those details they either don't understand or the details that they don't deem to be particularly important. And lastly, there was a distortion known as sharpening, where the story went, the events in the story were told in a reverse chronological order to better accommodate the boys' schemas. So, even though this study was initially conducted in the 1930s, a lot of subsequent research by memory scientists seems to confirm the general findings that Bartlett discovered. So, for example, Sulin and Dooling in 1974 tested one of Bartlett's theories, and particularly they hypothesized that schema-driven errors are more likely to occur with the increased passage of time or longer retention intervals because schematic information or the information provided by schemas is more durable than simply memorizing through rote memorization the contents of a story. So, in this particular study, they presented two groups of participants with the same general story about a dictator. And what differed between the groups was the name given to the dictator. So, in the control group, the dictator was given the name Gerald Martin, which was a random moniker that didn't have any prior association or fame, right? And in the experimental condition, the dictator was referred to as Adolf Hitler, right? And so the critical dependent variable or outcome variable is they asked participants whether or not they remembered reading a statement that the dictator hated Jewish people, which didn't actually appear at all in the story. And they also manipulated the amount of time that had passed. So, in the short retention interval condition, where only 5 minutes had passed since the participants read the story, there was no difference between the groups. So, both groups basically said no, the dictator didn't say that. whereas after a long retention interval, or 7 days, participants who read about Hitler were much more likely to incorrectly agree that they had read a statement about his feelings regarding Jewish people, than the people that hadn't read about Hitler and were just given the generic name Gerald Martin, right? So what that demonstrates is that memory is reconstructive and based on our schemas, right? So obviously our schema for Adolf Hitler is that he was a terrible human being whose anti-Semitism was just off the charts, right? Um, and so we assume that if Adolf Hitler was a dictator, he would have made a statement like that, even though that statement didn't actually appear in the passage. So, another really interesting study that attempted to replicate some of Bartlett's findings was this study by Carmichael and colleagues. And so basically, if you were a participant in this study, you would be exposed to the stimulus figures depicted in orange on the diagram, right? And you would either be given the purple label or the green label. So, given the object in orange, the first object in orange, you would either be given the label eyeglasses or the label dumbbells. And then later, they asked the participants to draw the object from memory. And what they found is that even though the initial stimulus object was fairly ambiguous, a week later, when participants drew the object from memory, their objects were more typical of the particular label, right? So the initial object in orange here could be a pair of glasses or it could be a dumbbell, right? It doesn't really have any defining features. But when participants were given the label eyeglasses, their subsequent drawings of the object a week later more closely resembled sunglasses. So you'll see in the purple drawing there, they gave the middle line between the two circles more of a ridge, which is what we would expect for a pair of eyeglasses. And in contrast, if they were given the label dumbbells, their subsequent drawing included two lines connecting the two circles, and they look far more similar to dumbbells. So here again, we see that the category label given for these ambiguous objects influenced or activated rather the particular schemas that people have for these objects, and those schemas influenced what they drew, such that their objects were more prototypical of either glasses or dumbbells, right? So the conclusion is that the category label they were given biased both their perception and their storage of the objects in memory. However, a later study that attempted to replicate the Carmichael study led researchers to a slightly different conclusion. So Prentice in 1954 conducted a follow-up study. And his methods were identical to the original Carmichael and colleagues study, but instead of asking participants to draw the objects, they were simply asked to recognize the objects. So they were shown either prototypical glasses or dumbbells or the original image, and they were asked which one is most similar to what they saw, and they found that the label effect disappeared under recognition conditions, right? So they correctly identified the original objects rather than incorrectly identifying the dumbbells or the glasses as being the closest representation of the object they saw, right? So what this led the researchers to conclude is that the bias observed by Carmichael and colleagues likely arose during retrieval rather than encoding because the items were not distorted because the items that were not distorted um, were the ones that they or the items that were not distorted were the ones that they recognized, right? So their drawings or retrieval of the objects were distorted by the labels. But what was actually stored or encoded in their memories was the actual object, not influenced um, by the by the labels, right? So they had stored the correct object. It just became biased by the labels when they subsequently attempted to draw it, right? So what that illustrates is that even though a lot of Bartlett's findings have been later replicated via laboratory experiments, um, there are, often contradictory findings, or there are often ways in which we can overcome those biases created by schemas, right? So again, in this case, it turns out the participants had stored the correct object in orange in their memories, but it just became distorted during the retrieval process when they were attempting to draw the object from memory. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about Bartlett's methodology and some of the criticisms of his approach. So basically, Bartlett believed that what happens when we have schema-driven errors and distortions in memory is that reality becomes kind of juxtapositioned with our schemas in a process known as reconstruction, right? But a lot of people criticized Bartlett for failing to conduct or report any sort of statistical tests, right? So basically, all of his research was basically just writing up or looking at differences between the original story and the boys' subsequent retellings of the story, but none of it was quantitative. It was all very much qualitative. And he also only provided extremely vague instructions to his participants. So these instructions might have caused deliberate guessing, um, which could have caused a lot of the distortions um, that the subsequent retellings of the story indicated. So it could just be that based on the vague questioning and open interview style, the participants were just sort of guessing and maybe not particularly invested in providing the most detailed responses, right? However, many of his findings have stood the test of time. But I did want to illustrate also an example of a case where schemas can be helpful, right? So we've talked about schemas as causing distortions thus far, but there was a study by Bauer and colleagues in 1975. And so basically, the participants' task in this study was to draw very sort of random drawings that were very difficult to reproduce. And so what they manipulated was whether or not these ambiguous drawings came with a label or not. So if you look at the diagram in the slide, for example, possible labels for the drawing in pane A might be vain triangle kissing its own reflection in a mirror, or ball balancing on a seal for the drawing in pane B, and close up of a pig looking at book titles in a library for panel C, and lastly, a whale about to floss for the drawing in panel D. And so when participants were given these supporting labels, they were able to reproduce these drawings a lot more accurately and to recognize and to retrieve them more efficiently than they would have been able to do otherwise, right? So in many cases, schemas are actually helpful to our memory in the sense that they help us to recall prototypical events, and they also allow us to, for example, predict what might happen in the future. So, in a very famous study, Brewer and Treyens asked participants to wait briefly in a room that was labeled a graduate student's office. And after about 3.5 seconds in the room, they were escorted to a different location and asked to recall all of the items that had been in the room, either by listing them out with a paper and pencil or by drawing a picture of the office. And what Brewer and Trans discovered is that the lists of objects and the drawing of the office was basically determined by whether or not the objects found in the office were typical of most people's schemas for an office. So, for example, 29 out of 30 participants correctly remember that there was a table and chairs, right? Which makes sense because almost every office we've ever seen has had a table and a chair or some kind of workspace. But there were also less typical items that most of our office schemas wouldn't include, right? So, for example, only 3 out of 30 people noticed in their drawings or their list of objects that there was a skull on the shelf, right? Because most academic offices are not going to include body parts, right? That's kind of strange and unusual. And similarly, only 9 out of 30, so approximately 1/3 of participants, recalled seeing shelves of books, right? And what's interesting is that in this office, there were no shelves with books, right? So they incorrectly remembered seeing bookshelves, even though none of them were present, right? So what the Brewer and Trans study illustrates is that sometimes we make what are called schema-driven errors, where we either we miss information that's inconsistent with our schemas, or we incorrectly recall information consistent with our schemas. So this concludes my lecture on semantic memory. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.